You're listening to Sound Money from Casey Research.
Hello and welcome to the show with me, your host, Andy Duncan, coming to you from London. My special guest tonight is Jeff Deist, the new president of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, based in Auburn, Alabama, which is one of the two main Rothbardian centers of Austrian economics in the world. The other is the annual Bodrum Conference in Turkey, where Jeff and I first met while he was chief of staff for Congressman Ron Paul. Today we're going to speak about Jeff's personal vision for the Mises Institute, how Austrian economics can help make people wealthier, and how to gain practical knowledge about the Austrian school. Hello, Jeff.
Good evening. Good afternoon for me.
Fantastic. Now, the von Mises Institute has been hugely successful in the last few years, spreading its ideas of economic truth and Austrian economics to everyone who wants to hear these ideas. As its new president, what's your personal vision as to how you're going to make this institute even better?
Well, thank you for that. It's kind words. I mean, we think we're doing better. We think that we're helping. I mean, the Austrian movement worldwide is really an animal unto itself. So it's certainly something that we want to be at the heart of and something we want to encourage, but we certainly don't have the hubris of one who would, we don't consider ourselves all powerful in the movement or all encompassing by any stretch. I mean, Austrianism has really, as you know, evolved into the social sciences, into political philosophy, into ethics, into all kinds of areas beyond, so let's say, the more pure economic stuff that we tend to focus on at Mises. But, I guess more than anything, we want to be the clearinghouse. We want to be sort of home plate in baseball terms for people to, always have a touchstone, always have a place they can come to for reference material. I mean, we have just an amazing amount of Austrian content on our site, for instance, for free, often in, ebook or PDF or downloadable form. So you don't have to go out and spend a lot of money to educate yourself about the giants of the Austrian school. So clearly one of our big goals is to remain and to improve upon what I hope is our standing as, again, the epicenter of the Austrian movement. Now, beyond that, I mean, personally, I have a million goals. There's so much to do, and, as I'm sure you know better than most, Leviathan never sleeps, right? So we have to be right there matching step for step. But I'll just throw this out because there's too many to mention. But one of my biggest personal goals, Andy, is to really and truly resurrect Rothbard as the great of the second half of the 20th century in Austrian economics. The left, and unfortunately many even on the right and in libertarian circles, when I say left, right, I mean in U.S., in American terms, tried to bury Mises. They tried to prop up Hayek as the good Austrian. And Hayek was obviously a very great man, very influential in Austrianism, but he was also the more accessible, sort of the easier Austrian. And they tried to sort of bury Mises and push him to the side. But now, a few decades later, he's absolutely established as one of the greats of the 20th century. There's no going back and burying Mises at this point. I mean, his name is now fully established. But Rothbard, there's still an awful lot of people who don't like him. There's still an awful lot of people who, think he's uncool, who think he's unhip, who he said uncomfortable things. But he's a giant, and his stuff needs to be read, especially amongst young people. And I think that his legacy, unfortunately, is still up in the air. We still have a lot to do to solidify and establish him, and really give credence to the work that he did, because the economics establishment, academia, certainly shortchanged him during his lifetime. But now I will say that we are dead set against allowing sort of the modern and cultural establishment to bury him after his lifetime.
Now, if you're a hardcore Rothbardian like I am, you tend to regard Hayek as a bit of a socialist. If people did want to get into Murray Rothbard, what do you think are the best books to start with? Which do you think are the most accessible Rothbard books for any aspiring student to get into?
Well, there's no question that Man, Economy, and State is all you would ever need. And frankly, as almost a textbook, it's, to me anyway, far more accessible, easier to read than much of Mises's stuff. Look, if you want a starting point, just read his little pamphlet, What Has Government Done to Our Money? I mean, it's about 90 pages. You can read it on a quick flight. You can read it in 45 minutes to an hour. And if you read it and comprehend it, you will know more about money probably than 95% of the people walking the earth. So between those two extremes, you could find just about anything you wanted from Murray, including just short articles and essays on a whole bunch of topics way beyond just econ. Everything from social science to politics to movie reviews even. So there's no lack of stuff to read, stuff to find from Murray. But if you don't have the stomach or the time for Man, Economy, and State as a starter, I guess I would recommend What Has Government Done to Our Money? Because then you'll get a real sense of how witty a writer he is and how easy a writer he is for average lay people to comprehend.
I must say, I found Man, Economy, and State a bit daunting when it arrived one day at the door. I think another book after What the Government Has Done to Our Money is possibly The Mystery of Banking, as another kind of plank into Murray Rothbard. And certainly Man, Economy, and State much easier to read, I think, than Human Action. Now, lots of our listeners are investors and they're believers in sound money. How can they best use the Mises Institute to make themselves wealthier? And how can they use it to diminish the effects of socialism upon their lives?
Well, it's interesting. There's now a whole class, small but growing, of fund managers who openly call themselves Austrians, right? Austrian Investing is sort of a new term that Mark Spitznagel, I think coined. He's the author of The Tao of Austria, The Tao of Capital, which is an Austrian investing book. He runs a fund down in Miami, Florida, which I believe is now closed. But I mean, there's a lot of ways I think that people can use Austrian economics to make themselves a lot more knowledgeable, not only about economics and life and politics and liberty, but about their particular finances, their particular investment situation. I mean, clearly understanding money, understanding central banks, understanding the power and the limits of fiat central banking ought to be key for any investor, because at the end of the day, if you're an American like me, your assets are probably denominated in U.S. dollars. So it's not a matter, so is the asset going up or down, or is the dollar it's valued in going up or down? That's always a huge question. And it's funny, this is one big knock on the Austrian schools. Well, you guys live in this theoretical bubble, and what's the real world application? And there's no Austrians actually out there sort of practicing this. And of course, now we know that that's not true. I mean, there's people who very openly apply Austrian principles, like Peter Schiff, for instance, in their own investment advice. But I would even go a step farther, and I would say, when it comes to the investment world and Keynesianism, which most of the mainstream financial press and the mainstream investment world still sort of spouts at least the main pillars of Keynesianism. My caution would be this: watch what people do, not what they say. And if you watch what people do and not what they say, you could even make a case that someone like a Warren Buffett is an Austrian in a sense. Because if you look at his track record of this hardcore value investing, never, ever overpaying for anything and giving up a possible home run hit to avoid the downside of overpaying, that value strategy, I think, oftentimes has an Austrian underpinning in the sense that the value somebody like a Warren Buffett seeks is always based on real rate of return net of the currency it's valued in, right? So in a certain sense, you could say that Warren Buffett has been shorting the dollar for many, many years now through Berkshire Hathaway, because the stuff that Berkshire Hathaway tends to buy is tangible physical stuff, right? They companies with underlying real world bricks and mortar assets, as opposed to, paperclips.com or some ephemeral startup. So Warren Buffett, I would say, is an example of somebody who talks a Keynesian game, but perhaps in his own personal life walks a more Austrian line.
His father was certainly a believer in gold as well, wasn't he? Now, lots of people find the Mises Institute who are looking for truth to get away from big government lies and Keynesian distortion and endless money printing. But going beyond that, Jeff, do you think it's possible for Austrian economics to break into the mainstream media? Do you think maybe a new thing for you to do as the president there could be to appoint a media director, or to get into the MSM? Or do you think the mainstream media is so hooked up with government that it's just not even worth bothering?
No, I would say it absolutely is worth bothering. And I think one of our big focuses in 2014 absolutely is going to be media penetration. And we're starting to see a lot of cracks. I mean, I mentioned Mr. Spitznagel just recently. He was on the new Maria Bartiromo Fox show and spent about an hour with her going over economic current events, financial current events, I should say, from an Austrian perspective. People like Jim Grant and Peter Schiff and David Stockman are out there gaining notoriety, gaining publicity, and certainly, what they do is newsworthy. So we're starting to see cracks, and I think a lot of people in the investment world understand that the entire banking and money system worldwide is just broken, and that something very calamitous is likely to happen if we don't change our course radically. So there's really only one school, even amongst free market schools, neoclassicalists, Friedmanite monetarists, supply-siders. None of them offer what Austrianism offers when it comes to explaining the booms and busts and explaining the need for commodity money over fiat money. So I think that's where our huge advantage lies, is that the unrest in monetary policy and what's happening with exploding debt on the balance sheets of central banks, or at least the U.S. central bank, that's really where we can offer the most bang for our buck. And I hope that we don't become, the Austrian school or Austrian commentators don't become more well-known because there's a horrific crash. I don't want that to happen. I don't want to be standing on a pile of rubble, hoisting the Austrian flag and saying, see, we were right. But nonetheless, when it comes to media interest in us, I would say we are somewhat counter-cyclical. And when things get worse, I think the media is going to pay more attention to us.
Yeah, we are sort of accused sometimes of being the Cassandra school, aren't we? Now, if there is going to be some kind of economic collapse with paper money, as predicted by people like Jim Rickards and our own Doug Casey, of course, for more of our potentially younger listeners out there who might not have a huge amount of savings to make serious investments with, what do you think for them are the practical benefits of learning more about Austrian economics?
Well, I guess they won't get pulled into some of the fallacies and nonsense out there about politics and about public policy and about economics, and also about their personal finance. I mean, hopefully a study of Austrian economics would lead a young person into a lifetime of smarter investing and also in avoidance of personal debt. I mean, if there's one thing young people can do now, it's get themselves off a track of a lifetime of debt via expensive college tuition and then mortgage, et cetera, because that's, especially for a young person, that's no way to live. And I think the whole fraud of money as debt is starting to become exposed. So if nothing else, if we can sort of disabuse young people of that, I think we do them great service. But beyond that, on a more general, not necessarily Austrian, but on a more general plane, is just encouraging and teaching young people to be resourceful, to think like entrepreneurs, to build skills in themselves that always make them marketable. I mean, there's no asset they can own that's greater than their own ability to go earn a living and make a living. And to do that, in the future, the skills that are needed might be very different than the skills that are needed now. I don't think we need too many more PhD professors in women's studies, but I do think we need some people who understand how to mine gold, find gold and mine it and pull it out of the ground, for instance.
Yeah, I think the principles of saving are quite key as well, aren't they? So again, someone like Doug Casey would say, spend less than you earn, save the difference and invest. Now, you talked earlier on about centralization, and my friend Helio Beltrao, who you might know, who helps run Mises Brazil, he likes the starfish model of spreading Austrianism around the world, as well as having this kind of center, this kind of clearinghouse for Austrian ideas and Rothbard. Are you going to be helping people like Mises Brazil and Mises Sweden and all these other Mises Institutes around the world?
Oh, absolutely. Mises Canada has gotten very active in the past year or two. In boxing, you know the term punching above your weight. Well, the Mises Brazil really punches above its weight. I mean, their website is incredible, the amount of traffic they get, the amount of stuff that they translate into Portuguese. So really, there's a huge and emerging market, I think, for Austrian thought in South America. No question about it. So, I mean, we are very much interconnected with other Mises organizations, and of course, Hans Hoppe's annual event in Turkey is a beautiful way to sort of bring that together once a year. We're actually hosting Helio and some Brazilians here, in 2 months at our Rothbard graduate seminar here in Auburn. So it's in many ways a small world, but thankfully it's a growing world.
Now, moving on to some of your earlier work, you did some amazing things for Congressman Ron Paul, who I think is perhaps one of the only honest politicians in the world. Where do you see American politics headed in the next few years?
Well, it's a cul-de-sac. I mean, it's a complete non-starter for anyone who's interested in any sort of rational organization of society. As Lew Rockwell is famous for saying, a big federal government is a lousy way to organize a society. And ours really is. We're at the point now where through gerrymandering, most of the seats in Congress are absolutely safe Republican or Democrat seats, for one. We're also at the point where people are spending vast sums of money to win even small state, U.S. state level races. People are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to become a state senator or a state representative. These used to be sort of minor part-time things that only the dedicated political class wanted. People are spending now, even in congressional districts that are pretty minor in smaller states, people are easily spending $1 million. And I think for the 2016 presidential race, the winner will spend about $1 billion with a B. Obama spent over $700 million prevailing in 2012. So we've now reached the point where if you want to be president of the United States, you have to have the ability to raise $1 billion. And when you start to look at who has that sort of ability, there's only a handful of people walking God's earth who could come anywhere close to that. And unfortunately, Hillary Clinton's one of them. So we're really at a point where politics is a dead end, not only structurally and as a practical matter, but I mean in terms of policy and philosophy. Gerrymandering is just there's no common ground, and there's no sort of compromising and negotiating with the state, because the state is ever voracious. It'll never be satisfied.
Yeah, there aren't many small girls and small boys in wood shacks at the moment who are going to end up in the White House one day. Well, it's been great speaking to you again tonight, Jeff. How can our listeners find out more about the Institute?
Well, just go to Mises.org, MISES.org, and in the June-July timeframe, look for the rollout of our new website, which is going to be phenomenally leaps and bounds beyond our existing website, which is fairly dated in its architecture and lacking in the quality of its search function. So I think our new website will look and feel a hell of a lot better, and it'll be a lot more fun too.
And I very much look forward to seeing that website when it's live. Thank you for your time today, Jeff Deist, President of the Ludwig von Mises Institute.
Great, good night, and thanks very much for having me.
You can subscribe to Sound Money on iTunes or sign up to our subscription service at soundmoneyshow.com, where you can also listen to our growing catalogue of podcasts. These include interviews with some of the most famous speakers on money in the world. These include Jim Rogers, Doug Casey, Rick Rule, and Mark Farber, along with many others. A special thank you today to Jeff Deist for joining us on the show, and thank you too very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.